They're good little packets.
Yep. You know, those insulated lunchboxes are very nice.
Yeah.
When they close the oh, I had one of them also, yes. That's great. This, they were giving it in First so many yeah, they opened the charges. And I did open the charges. I just certainly remember when I just find it so close, overwhelmed. Everything is, you know, you get through the aisles. Do you? And you
I like it very much, yeah.
To have Betty Dietz, Pat Beadle,
Barbara DiTomaso.
Barbara. It's just Barbara. Who will be speaking about the sanctuary movement that FUSA was involved in. And it was a big event, I think, at that time. And for some of us who are not old members, it will be wonderful history for us to hear, oral history. And it is going to be taped so that future FUSAs can see it. Yes, Ethel?
Ethel was also an active member of
Oh, Ethel,
Sanctuary.
I'm sorry, Ethel Morrison also.
As
Are you
well
in-
as Mariana Means.
Okay,
Well, I guess Mariana Months.
so,
The microphone is yours. And welcome.
Okay.
I don't hold anything I don't have to except money. Thank you for asking us. It's always fun to talk about the sanctuary movement. And it's especially fun to get together with old friends and reminisce about the activities that we were involved in the 1980s when the Central American situation was really bad. I tried very hard to get Carl Valentine, who has moved back to Schenectady, and who was the chair of SRC at the time, and who was very instrumental in setting up the Sanctuary Committee. And for 2 weeks I thought he was going to come, but he's a consultant, he travels a lot, and something else came up, so he could not be here. And it would have been very interesting to hear the real inside facts. I think Vic Walker was president at the time, I believe, of the congregation, and so he would have been helpful also. But the situation in the 1980s was that we were supporting dictators, so-called presidents perhaps, in Central American countries who were persecuting their own citizens. And when those citizens tried to come to the United States, our State Department wouldn't recognize them as legal political refugees because that would be admitting that we were supporting somebody who was persecuting their own citizens. So they were not considered to be legal, even though our Congress had ratified a UN protocol on political refugees, saying that they would be accepted. So it was a very bad situation. And in the early 80s, the UUA and the UUSC sent a letter to every congregation, I believe, asking them to study the situation and to look into their hearts and see whether they might be able to help these refugees. And at that time, there were people, religious people in Arizona who were sheltering refugees and offering them sanctuary. And I believe they set up headquarters in Chicago. And they sort of screened them there, and some of them were trained to be political activists, to speak for the situations in their own countries and to help educate Americans. So that is the project that the Albany Unitarians voted to become a part of. What we're going to do today is Pat Beadle is going to tell about the process that the Albany Friends meeting and the Unitarians went through to form this committee. And then Barbara is going to talk about how she became involved because Barbara DiTomaso works for the diocese. And then we will relate some of our individual experiences with some of the specific refugees. It was a really exciting time because some really wonderful people came through, and we are in contact with many of them still. And it was, for them, we were saving their lives and their children's lives, and I think that it's an experience they don't forget, and we don't forget. So Pat Beadle will tell you about the formation of the committee.
Thank you, Betty. Hello, everyone. It was an exciting time, and it's been fun to get together with Barbara and Betty and to rethink some of our adventures of that particular time. I'm a member of Albany Friends meeting and was at the time that we decided that we would try to provide sanctuary for people. It was first brought up in the meeting in December 1982, and it was discussed again at our first January meeting, and there was enthusiasm for it, but it was a pretty complicated business, and there were a lot of legal questions and concerns that people had about doing something that was not strictly legal. So there was a special meeting then in February 1984. So there's a period in here of some months before, and there were meetings in between with groups of people because there was a lot of concern about, going to jail and what would happen to us if INS or other groups decided to investigate us. And here in March '84, I see a notation that the meeting is not yet prepared to offer sanctuary. The Ministry and Council Committee was charged to continue to inform the meeting members of what would be involved. So, friends go through a whole lot of machinations before they, and not only that, but serious searches about what is their, what is the requirement of their basic religious philosophy and what are they able to do, personally to carry that out. So in March, Kate Skelton-Caban gave us a list of churches who had agreed to support such a project. And there was a task force put together that would work further on this and develop a letter to send to possible helpful churches. And anyway, in September, finally, 1984, our business meeting approved the attached covenant statement drawn up by the Sanctuary Task Group, which articulated the working relationship on sanctuary we have with the Unitarian Church of Albany. We approved sending the attached letter announcing our sanctuary to Attorney General William French Smith. So I have a copy of the covenant and of the letter that was sent to William French Smith. Friends have a wonderful policy of keeping minutes and for years, maybe centuries. So it's wonderful to be able to go back and look at the history and see it just laid out there. So I was very fortunate to be able to do that. And so I don't know whether you want the details on that. Betty mentioned some of the things that we were concerned about. It says that we've invited refugees from El Salvador and Guatemala to accept temporary sanctuary in solidarity with congregations of many faiths throughout the United States and as a symbolic act. Since the resources of each society are limited, while the demands of providing sanctuary are extensive, the First Unitarian Society of Albany and the Albany Friends Meeting enter into this covenant whereby the resources organized and allocated for the sanctuary project by each society will be combined into a single effort. Decisions concerning the project, whether or not to accept a refugee, how the project resources shall be allocated, how the overall management of the project will proceed, will be done by consensus of the parties designated by the two churches to manage the project. Funds raised to meet costs of the project will be managed through a single account to be maintained under the aegis of Albany Friends Meeting. Funds raised to meet possible bail needs will be maintained in a bail fund under the aegis of the First Unitarian Society of Albany. Voluntary monitors, drivers, interpreters, and others needed to successfully provide sanctuary shall be recruited, trained, and asked to serve as participants of a common project. As additional religious organizations in the Albany area invite refugees from El Salvador and Guatemala to accept sanctuary, they will be encouraged to join this covenant so that together we will be better able to assist our Salvadorian and Guatemalan brothers and sisters. And the president or chair or clerk or whatever the title was, both signed this covenant. So I have several copies if you want to make more one to have one. And then there's also this letter written to William French Smith, Attorney General of the United States. Just read the first paragraph. We're ready to inform you that on September 15th, 1984, Albany Friends Meeting expects to receive openly an undocumented refugee couple from El Salvador into the care and protection of our meeting house and meeting community. We realize in so doing that we will be in violation of the Immigration and Nationality Act, Section 274A. This action, which we take after much critical deliberation, reflects our belief that the current policy and practices of the U.S. government with regard to Central American refugees is illegal and immoral. So, there's more, but I don't want to dwell on that particularly. So that's how we started out. And on November 84, the meeting agreed to receive Sylvia and Pedro Ramos as guests for a few days on their return to grant them extended sanctuary. So in December, they were living with Liz Pearson down on Elm Street, and a subcommittee had approved a plan by which they would subsequently be guests in an independent apartment. So that started the whole need to raise money and to provide resources, and got a lot of other people involved in the project. But I haven't dwelled on the training and the soul searching that went into making this decision, people thinking about going to jail and whether they would be able to manage that in their lives, and the training for suppose INS people come when the refugees are in the meeting house and we are protecting them, because when they first came we had monitors there 24 hours a day. So there were a lot of angles to the situation that I won't go into right now, but I think you can imagine probably taking on a sort of an illegal project.
I'm the director of the Commission on Peace and Justice for the Catholic Diocese of Albany. And I have been working with Pat Beadle a lot in the early 1980s on the Upper Hudson Nuclear Freeze campaign. And because many of us thought we were going to have nuclear war by accident, if not by design, since we had a president who thought you could recall nuclear weapons once they were launched. He joked about attacking the Soviets while a live microphone was on and so on. So I held off for a little bit, giving my full attention to what was going on in Central America, because I knew that once I did that I would give myself wholeheartedly to it, and that's what happened. The first meeting that I attended of the Sanctuary Committee, it was announced that Pedro and Sylvia were coming and would be there shortly, so I was plunged right into the work. Unlike other people, I had no home to lose, I had no car to lose. I was living in a convent, I was a Catholic sister at the time. The car was provided by the diocese, so there would be no skin off my nose if it was taken. The penalties were pretty high, 5 years in prison, very large fines, the largest for smuggling, that would be actually bringing people into the country, crossing the border, but also for harboring, which was not even trying to hide them, but just having anything to do with their being here, and transporting refugees also, which we all did, and taking them to talks and taking them to whatever they needed, doctors or wherever. I'd like to say something about Pedro and Sylvia because their story was so compelling, and I think everybody realized that we had a moral obligation to protect these people. Pedro, these were not their real names, were they? No, we never knew the refugees' real name.
Alfredo.
Alfredo.
Her name was Mary.
Okay. I'll tell you a funny story about names that involve Mariana once a little later on. But Pedro was the third photographer for the Human Rights Commission in El Salvador that had been founded by Archbishop Oscar Romero. Archbishop Romero was assassinated 25 years ago this year, on March 24th, 1980. And the reason Pedro was the third photographer was because his two predecessors had been assassinated, and he was likely to be assassinated also. The reason was that by going out and photographing along the roadways, going into the dump, finding parts of bodies and so on, they were documenting the human rights abuses that were going on. Nobody could look at a head severed from a torso and say there's no persecution going on in El Salvador. He said that sometimes in the dump he would have to fight with dogs for parts of bodies, and it was like putting a puzzle together sometimes to figure out which limbs and which heads went with which torsos. Very gruesome stuff and really horrific for the people living through it. So it was obvious immediately that we were doing the right thing. At some point, the heat got turned up a little bit, and Pedro and Sylvia disappeared for a while. They returned, and I was in a room with them and did not recognize them. They had put on weight. He was wearing glasses, parted his hair differently, either had grown or gotten rid of a mustache, and so on. But it was because the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, was getting close. They were going to the homes of people on the Sanctuary Committee, not knocking on their doors, but knocking on their neighbors' doors and asking, have you seen anything suspicious? Well, what do you think this is designed to do? Break down community among neighbors, right? Because if they thought something suspicious was going on, they could have simply parked a block away and watched the home. And they did this to me. I was, later on, a family came that had been in Sanctuary. They wanted to go to Canada. They arrived here in Albany completely unannounced. Parents and 3 kids with the people who had been sheltering them in Sanctuary in New Hampshire. And they decided that they would like all the paperwork completed before they went to Canada. And I was led to believe in talking with people in Canada who were ready to receive them, that this would be a matter maybe of a couple of weeks. Well, it became 6 months. But the first thing that I had to do was find a place for them to stay, and I did find an unused home that the owners were willing to let us use. It wasn't being rented at the time. And I was with them because they had a baby, and they had 2 school-age kids. The free school in Albany accepted the kids and agreed not to keep any records. And so I was needed to drive the kids back and forth to school and, get milk and Pampers and all the things that a small baby needs. And of course, these people did not have a car of their own. I got a call one night from the sisters I had been living with saying that they had gotten a call from the INS, and they said they were looking for me because they had a subpoena for me. The trials were going on in Tucson of the leaders of the National Sanctuary Movement. And I didn't know this at the time. I knew the trial was going on, but they said they wanted to subpoena me for the trial. They had my phone number, they knew where I lived, they didn't call up and ask for me, they didn't sit in their car and wait outside the apartment until I should appear. But they called up and they made the people I had been living with feel in danger. I moved out the next morning because I was afraid they would stumble over this family in the process of looking for me. I got in touch with a criminal lawyer and found out I did not have to make myself available to them. It was up to them to find me. And also called the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York City, who were the defense lawyers in the trial. And they said that the INS was flying their people all over the country with subpoenas that they had no interest in delivering to people. Do you serve a subpoena? I don't know what the right verb is.
Serve.
Yes. Yeah. What had happened was their star witness had obviously perjured himself. Here was a person whose English capability was so poor that he needed a translator during the trial, and yet he claimed to have infiltrated these Bible study groups where in churches where sanctuary was being conducted, and recalling conversations that had happened entirely in English 5 years earlier. Now, no jury was going to believe this. The reason that they were looking for somebody from the Albany sanctuary was because they said Pedro had a legitimate claim to asylum. And the fact that he did not appeal for asylum to the United States government was proof that the sanctuary movement was politically motivated and not religiously motivated. At the time, the U.S. was, I think, admitting maybe about 5 to 8% of Salvadorans who applied for asylum and 1 to 2% of Guatemalans. There was more publicity about the situation in El Salvador just because the country was more developed, not by a great deal, but then Guatemala was among the indigenous people in Guatemala, and they were mainly the targets of persecution there. The word sanctuary has 2 meanings. It means a place of safety, like we have our nature sanctuaries and our bird sanctuaries, but it also means a place where God's order is in effect, or there's a divine presence, or where other people cannot come and impose their own set of rules. And it was a way of saying to the government, while we stand in the doorway of the Friends meeting, in the doorway of the Unitarian Church, you can come this far but no further. You have no authority here, and we will not allow you to assert a false authority here. We really felt responsible for the lives of these people. It wasn't just a case of getting them apartments and clothing, and I mean, imagine coming from Central America and experiencing an Albany winter. And if they wanted to study English, trying to facilitate that. But it was a case of realizing that they had been traumatized, that they had seen horrific things, that they had fled for their lives, that they constantly lived with the fear of being captured and deported. Early in the war in El Salvador, an entire plane load of Salvadorans who had been captured here in the United States were sent back and were all slaughtered when they arrived. Because it was assumed that the only reason they would want to flee would be because they were not in agreement with their government's agenda. Betty said if I had more to say it. I think our favorite refugee, maybe I shouldn't speak for all of us, was Lucio Perez Reynoso. Lucio is a young Quiche Maya. There are 22 distinct groups of Mayan Indians in Guatemala. They have their own languages and their own weaving patterns, which are sort of their identity. And Lucio's father had been involved in community development work among his people. He had taken them up into virgin forest. They had carved out a large agricultural cooperative in the highlands of Guatemala. And he had been warned that he was to stop this work, but he continued, and in the end he was shot in the back of the head and killed. Lucio and his family fled to Antigua, which was the ancient capital of Guatemala. And one day, one of his brothers was walking down the street, and Lucio said the spies were all over, and they were told that they were all being sought. And his brother was shot in the back one day. The bullet pierced his spine and paralyzed him. So, prior to that, his mother had taken the younger kids and fled into Nicaragua. So, friends somehow got the paralyzed brother into Nicaragua. Lucio was 14 years old at the time, and he was a courier for the Peasant Union of Guatemala. He could have been killed if he had been caught carrying any of these documents, but under persecution, you grow up very quickly. He stayed on for a little while longer, and then he joined his family in Nicaragua. His brother had phantom pain in his legs, and he was asking to have his legs amputated. And so Lucio, who maybe by this time was 16 years old, rides a bus he flew from Nicaragua to Mexico City, and then he rode a bus into Arizona, and at the border, no one checked for passports or visas. Now, if you've ever been to that border, you know that it's like a war zone there. So that's the first amazing thing. Lucio made his way to New Jersey, where there was an Episcopalian church waiting for a guest in sanctuary. And they raised the money over the course of a year to bring his brother to Chicago on a medical visa and have him examined. And he was told that, if they moved that bullet slightly, it could mean his death. So the brother went back to Nicaragua. And here is a 16-year-old boy, a man really, saying to himself, now that I'm here, how can I use this to help my people? The Mayan culture is very community-centered. When a baby is born, its umbilical cord is buried in the village because it's expected that that's where the body will be buried after they die. So to have his whole village actually fled and found each other in Nicaragua. I don't know how they did this. But we at the time were looking for a Guatemalan guest. We had several Salvadorans. And Lucio came to Albany. And here's the other amazing thing. As probably many of you know, there is a large and very esteemed Department of Mesoamerican Studies at the State University here. Instead of saying Central America, they say Mesoamerica. At the University of Albany is a professor, Bob Carmack, who knew Lucio's father in Guatemala. He's an anthropology professor, had written about his father's work and his father's assassination in one of his books. There are 5,400 colleges and universities in the United States. What are the odds of that happening? So here was the proof published that Lucio's story was true, and he was granted political asylum here in the United States, the only one of the refugees, I think, besides the Montanans. Yeah, we think he was the only one who was granted asylum. Lucio, in that same month, got his GED and then said he wanted to go to college. So I managed to find funding and work study and so on. He's a graduate of the College of St. Rose, and then wanted to go to law school so that he could go back to Guatemala and represent the indigenous people in the legislature where they had no representation. Because of his unbelievable story, he was accepted at the law school of the University of Miami. He failed the boards on his first try, then became the director of a mine center in Florida for a large number of Guatemalans who are agricultural workers there. And a couple of months ago tried the law boards again. He's due to get the results this week, so hold him in your heart, please. Okay, I think we have other stories that Pat and Betty would like to tell of some of our families. Thank you.
Another of our early refugees was Marie Carmen, whom some of you may remember. Marie Carmen Rivera came with her 2 children after she had been terrorized by the government. And I remember her speaking to the forum one Sunday morning, and she had her children on each side. One of the youngsters was a 12-year-old girl named Veronica, and the other was a 9-year-old boy. He kept prodding her and whispering something to her in Spanish. And she said, "My son wants me to tell about how when the soldiers pointed their shotguns at me." And this really terrified that little boy. So she was here for maybe 6 or 8 months and then went to Canada and now lives in Ottawa. And her daughter, who was asked here, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" and responded, "President of El Salvador." Her daughter has graduated from the University of Texas in Houston, and her son has graduated from a technical college in Canada and is working as a construction supervisor. And Marie Carmen takes care of foster children until they're adopted. She lives with a Quaker man and has for almost since she got to Canada. And I was talking with her daughter on the phone several months ago and said, "I'm embarrassed, I'm sort of hesitant to ask this, and I never would think of asking your mother, but did your mother and Charles get married?" Because I just didn't know, I just didn't care about it, just was curious. And she said, "I don't really know." But her mother has done a lot of wonderful work. And she, as far as I could tell, the reason they were after her is that she had taken part in some demonstration while she was in college in San Salvador, and they had her fingered. I could never find any other reason why the government was after her. She was definitely threatened. And I did ask her recently, "By the way, how did you get into this country?" And she said, "We came over in a car, and the children were riding up in the car with the driver, and I was in the trunk with a man that I don't know who he was. And we came across, and they didn't inspect the trunk. So she was really fortunate, but a really wonderful woman." the other, Pedro and Sylvia, who were really Alfredo and Miriam. And once when the INS was here looking for them, they were asking for them by a name which nobody here knew them by, so it was okay. You weren't lying, you just didn't know them. They went to Montreal, and Pedro went to college and got a degree in social work, I believe. And she, the last I heard, was studying for a degree in photography. And they had gone back. When I took them to Union College. One of the objectives of the sanctuary program was to educate the community. And so they went out and gave talks to schools or churches or whoever. And I took them to Union College. I took him to Union College. And one of the students said, "Well, do you think you ever go back? Do you ever think about your own country?" And he said, "There isn't a day that goes by that I don't, because we left something very precious there." And it turns out they had a child, and they had left the child with the grandparents. And they didn't get that boy until he was maybe 12 or 13 years old. And she went down, met her mother in Mexico, and stayed for a week or so to get acquainted with the youngster, and then brought him back to Canada, which was a mixed experience, I guess, because the kid wasn't accustomed to having two parents who would monitor his activities. So, maybe Pat. Victor Montejo was Mayan also, and he was a teacher in a little village in the mountains. He had been identified as a youngster, he was very bright, and his father was encouraged to send him to school and put him on a horse one day with a bundle of corn or something and sent him off to a village over the hills and far away where there was a school. And he became a teacher eventually and was assigned to this little village up in the mountains where the army one day sent some troops, and the local militia thought they were guerrillas because the guerrillas and the army wore the same kind of uniforms. And so the local militia went after them, and the army, and a couple of them were wounded. And so they came in and looked for the person who was at fault. And he looked like Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo, and they pointed at Victor and arrested him and took him off to jail, to the army headquarters. And this happened, and they told him that they let him go this time, but next week when he came home for the weekend, he would have to tell them what was going on up there. And he had nothing to report, so they were going to make it really hard for him. So some Americans from Bucknell happened through at that time, and they were anthropologists. They were very interested in what he was doing, which was writing down the legends, like the fables that parents told their children to teach them the traditions and the customs. And these anthropologists were very interested, and they realized that he was in great danger, so they invited him to go to a conference in Pennsylvania and brought him back into safety in this country. And a couple years later, his wife wrote to him and said, "People are beginning to say that you're not really in America, that you're really up in the mountains with the guerrillas, and I'm beginning to get scared." So he sent for her, and she came with the children. So by that time, he was a student at SUNY in the anthropology department, and he was legal as a student, but she was illegal. So she looked to the Sanctuary Committee for a great deal of help and advice with her situation and with the 3 children. And he has written this book, which is Testimony, Death of the Guatemalan Village, which is about his own personal experience. And then he wrote this book of poetry And he has written this book about the Popol Vuh, the twins who are supposed to be the founders of the Mayan culture. And this is for children. And he's written another book too that I don't know what it is. He got his PhD at the University of Connecticut and is now a professor at Davis. And he went back to his town with his wife, who then thinks is the smartest woman in the world. She dropped out of school when she was 14 and she was typing his papers for his classes in English. And for many of these Mayans, they didn't really speak Spanish even. They only spoke the Mayan tongue. So there are 3 children. One of them has just graduated from medical school. One of them graduated from Montana, University of Montana. And the younger one is at the University of California studying computer science. So these kids, the kids have all done. These refugees have just been amazing. It's been really exciting. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? I understood that Fuser kept families down in the basement here. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe that the idea was that they would spend part of their time here being sheltered by Fusons and part of their time at the Friends, who had a nice upstairs room. Oh yes, I have to tell you, when Marie Carmen came with those 2 children, part of the job of the refugees was to go over to the Social Action Center where Sanctuary had an office or desk and do things, put out a newspaper.
I think you have newsletters.
Newsletter. Barbara has copies of all the newsletters. And so she was going to go over there one day and be indoctrinated as to what the responsibilities of the refugees are. So I went over to the Friends Meeting House to take care of the kids. They've been here about 5 days, maybe, possibly 4. And while I was there, the little boy went upstairs to take a shower. And he didn't come down, didn't come down, didn't come down. And I sent his sister to see if everything was okay. And she said, the door's locked and he can't get it open. So we tried to figure out how to get him to unlock the door, and then pretty soon there was no response from the inside. And then he appeared in another room. And that kid had climbed out the window onto the roof outside, which is a sloping roof, and then to get into the window of another room, he had to pull off the storm window, and it had fallen in the room. And he didn't want to admit this because he knew he was in trouble for having broken the window. And so when he appeared, he was crying and sobbing about his hand. And I said, well, if your hand is that bad, maybe I should take you to the doctors, to the hospital. Well, the little girl translated that for him, and he decided it wasn't that bad. And then he admitted how he climbed back in and broken the window. And I thought, she got those kids out of the country. She got them across the border safely. She got them to Albany, and I let them fall off the roof. But I want to say finally, I think that the most exciting part of this whole project was the ecumenical nature of it, because we had people from all kinds of religious groups who were working together and just ignoring their religious differences, but working for the betterment of this community of people who were so much in need of a peaceful place to live.
We can bring the microphone over.
Have her come up.
While she's coming up here, I'll let Pat say her comment. Come on up, Ethel. Yeah, you need the microphone. Okay.
Well, I just wanted to say, as a friend, it was as Betty said, a wonderful experience to work with all these different religious groups, and obviously we all learned so much. We learned about what our foreign policy really means in the lives of other people around the world, and particularly in Central and South America. And it certainly informed our thinking about our foreign policy ever since, I think. because we know enough to ask questions, and we feel deeply the suffering that many people have been afflicted with as a result of some of our policies, and that we need to learn so much more about other people in the world and what the gifts that they have to give us, because these refugees gave us so many gifts. They had lived in such impoverished lives in many ways, but they had wonderful wisdom and generosity and so on that we all need to remember.
I think you have heard so much about what we were able to do here. We were the only two congregations that actually declared sanctuary in Albany. We had much cooperation from other groups. And just a couple of minor small things that I wanted to mention was that while Pedro and Sylvia were living here, the FBI, whoever they were, came to the door of the church, the hall, and wanted to come in. And fortunately, there were a few of us having a meeting, and since I had had experience with fending off these characters in my personal life, I went to the door, and the man at the door said, we'd like to come in and look around. And I said, do you have a search warrant? And they said, oh no, we just want to talk to you and talk to everyone. I said, you don't come in unless you have a search warrant. Slam the door, and they never came back. And I guess the other story that I had to tell is just what you heard about. I was one of the group that went around with, it was Pedro and Sylvia, who wished to talk about their experiences in Guatemala and such places. And we made appointments for them at places like student groups at RPI and various other groups. And of course, we all knew that if we were caught at this, we would have a problem, which was okay with us. And somehow they never did do this. So we went on about our business. That's all I wanted to add.
Betty, was there any particular, can you identify any policy that Canada had toward the undocumented? Was it sort of open country like it was back in the fugitive slave days?
I believe their immigration laws were much more liberal than ours at that time.
Did they make a distinction between the documented and the undocumented?
Well, if they had signed on to the UN protocol as the United States did, they shouldn't have differentiated between them. The thing is that the State Department was making this decision. I mean, we were supposed to accept refugees who were fleeing persecution from their own governments, and which these people clearly were. And I don't know.
Canada had a very liberal immigration policy for immigrants as well as refugees. A refugee by international law is someone who has a well-founded fear of persecution by reason of their religion, their politics, their social group, whatever it was. In El Salvador, being poor puts you in that group. So it's a well-founded fear, which is very subjective. It's a person's own designation of themselves as a refugee by saying, I have this well-founded fear. The government's role then is to acknowledge their designation of themselves as a refugee by granting them asylum. And not only the UN protocol, but the Convention on Refugees obligated our government to that. And we always maintain we were not doing what was illegal, our government was doing what was illegal. I took refugees to Canada several times. They did a couple of things. They could be admitted immediately, but they would be in sort of a financial limbo for a while until their case came up. Whereas if they did all the paperwork from outside the country, as soon as they stepped foot on Canadian soil, they were landed immigrants, which here we would call legal residents, I think. And they would qualify for all social services, including job counseling or job training, and so on. As the 80s went on, though, Canada began to tighten its policy because so many people were pouring in. By then, there was persecution in a number of other places in the world also, wars in Africa. When I sat in this huge waiting area of a social services center in Montreal with a refugee, the vast number of people there were black. They were from former French colonies in Africa or in the Caribbean. The second largest number were Latin American, and I remember one white elderly Caucasian woman who was emigrating from France to join her son in Canada. And I think Canadians saw that their society was becoming more racially mixed and were starting to pull back a little in fear, but also there was such a backlog of cases to be dealt with that their legal system just couldn't handle it. So they did tighten up the regulations, and at one point they actually said, unless you have a visa, you cannot come into Canada, even if you're a refugee. So there was a bottleneck in Plattsburgh at that point.
About a year and a half ago, we had the records from the Sanctuary Committee and turned them over to the archives at the State University, where they were collecting records that were of political interest, of things that have happened in Albany. And so that's where, if you want to know anything, which we didn't tell you, that's where you go to find out, I guess. Thank you all for listening.
I just want to say Mariana Muntz was also a key member of the
yes, she
Sanctuary
was.
Committee.
I think we had a wonderful program, and I'm just so sorry that so many people didn't come, but I'm happy that it's been televised and we have preserved for future reference. We thank you, Betty Dietz, Sister Barbara, Pat Beagle, and Ethel Morrison. And I want you all to remember that it's the third Monday of every month that we have Shannon's Circle. We want to also welcome one newcomer to our circle, gentleman in the pink shirt, and I'm embarrassed to say I don't know your name. Will you introduce yourself?
I'm John Mead. I've been coming here for about 2.5 years.
And Priscilla has brought a guest who is a wonderful cake servant.
Stanley Hayward.